Hello, and welcome to Mountain Standard Time. I'm, of course, your host, Nathan Giede, and today we'll be talking with two different guests. A little bit later today, that is to say about 10:30 Mountain, 9:30 Pacific, we'll have Nadine Wellwood come on, an independent journalist from Alberta who has been at a few of the lockdown protests, and she can tell us what that's all about. And then in the second half of the show, I'll be joined by Sheldon Clare, president of the National Firearms Association. Remember to like the Western Standard on Facebook to be notified when we go live, and subscribe to support our content. Unlike the CBC, we don't get $1 billion check from the Liberals every year to propagandize you. I'm getting tired of talking about the lockdowns, to be honest with you. Vaccines, reopenings, and provincial health officers. But the truth is, they keep making it an issue, so we in the media have to keep talking about it. In all honesty, if they declared the pandemic over tomorrow and rescinded all restrictions, if they didn't even acknowledge their incompetence or say sorry, I'd probably forgive them for just having my freedoms back. But they won't, and they can't. They are in too deep with the world watching, commenting on what they do, paying little to no heed to the needs of their citizens, crying for help. Government policy is always a hostage situation. This is very important that everybody take note of that. It is always a hostage situation. Always. And they have all the hostages. If you want to negotiate with them, you must give them a better hostage than the one they already have in their grip. At the moment, we are all hostages without leverage. I'd argue that the government itself is holding itself to ransom as well, or at least certain parts of it. In a way, COVID is this beautiful tragic comedy that finally reveals just how not in control our elected officials are. The real premiers, indeed the absolute monarchs of every province in Canada right now, are the provincial health officers, not the elected. And of course, those provincial health officers have armed guards, armed enforcers with uniforms to install their will. I'm not here to play devil's sympathizer. The letter and spirit of the law state unequivocally that if our elected leaders were to take back their role and overrule the bureaucrats, they'd be fully in their rights. And every elected official or civic leader who is failing to do this right now is guilty of an all but unforgivable sin against their office, against their vocation. But they appear to have literally forgotten their authority. We must acknowledge that from the moment Victory in Europe was declared, an anniversary we celebrated actually just a few days ago, Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, and even just before the Second World War, life had become increasingly complicated, particularly when it came to government policy. A lot of that had to do with the Great Depression and all the socialized programs we attempted to implement afterwards. Not saying all of those were bad ideas, just saying they complicated things. Our solution to this complication was to let civil servants, not elected representatives, oversee policies and projects. Indeed, we hoped that by making bureaucrats the main functionaries of the state, there would be less corruption and more transparency. For that matter, we believed budgets would be kept and the state would hum along far smoother than any politician could run it. We fundamentally said only the disinterested, unelected, apolitical apparatchik can be trusted. We truly believe this. COVID has proven that even the cats, it looks like cats, but it's actually crats, short for bureaucrats. It's something we used to use in politics all the time. I'll try that again. COVID has proven that even the crats can't be trusted entirely, as if there wasn't ample proof of this elsewhere. And that's, well, at some point, the people's voice must be heard. The problem is that so much of our respect and our respective democracy, as well as our representative democracy, has been outsourced from actual voting members that we don't have much of a say at this point. And to reverse this trend, a severe amount of major civic reform would be necessary. We'd have to take back an awful lot of power. Hopefully we forget that before we're too late. And I don't personally want to be a serf in Bonnie Henry's czardom, in her little her fiefdom. I don't want Czar Henry to be my overlord forever, but we're stuck with it for now. We're stuck with it. So here we are, we're well over a year into the pandemic. We have, of course, plenty of vaccines out there and whatever you might feel about the vaccines, whatever, that rollout's been terrible as well. But the point is that between people getting infected and recovering, as well as the vaccines, we should be reaching herd immunity pretty quick here. And yet there is no sign that things are going to improve. So I've told you a couple of times on this program that I have a dear beloved in my life. We're planning on getting married, and as we kind of plan for that, even though it's a little ways into the future, I won't give an exact time, but it's a little ways into the future. We still have we hold no hope for the idea that there's going to be people in that church other than us and those very immediate family members and the officiant. There's no there I don't hold out any hope for that, because we live in this time in British Columbia where people are where the restrictions just don't make sense. Now, if we were to try and get married at Costco, I mean, we could have everybody in there, but we can't do that at a church for some reason. I don't know why. And I guess what I'm trying to cue in on here is that we just hold out no hope. We've gotten so used to the reality of what we're living in right now is that we hold out no hope for that change. We of course, I hope someday our freedoms are returned, or I guess we rise up and just take them back, or just start living normally again. I'm not really interested in some kind of violent revolution necessarily. Violence is never the answer, but if we were to just all start living normally again tomorrow, I don't know if they could stop us. I don't think they could. But I think fundamentally, as literally as I participate in this whole planning exercise of trying to celebrate and trying to have a sacrament together and trying to gather people together and whatever else, and in the sense of like just trying to actually do this thing that you're supposed to do in life, I just hold out no hope that somehow the restrictions are going to be better then. I've had to try and tell people that over and over again. It's been a hard thing to say to people, but that's how it is. We're going to talk a little bit today as we kind of wait on our first guest. We're going to talk a little bit about a few different things that are happening here. So we're going to bring up one of our friendly competitors. That's the Rebel. And we are going to look into the fact that apparently they're going to accept ballots after Election Day in the upcoming federal election. I remember when I first heard about this, I asked a friend of mine about actually Sean Olick. He's been on this show before. And Sean made the point, he was saying this to somebody, I think one of the elected representatives who was commenting on this. He said this to him, said, well, you'd better fight that tooth and nail or else you'll never win another election again. And I don't know how much I want to play into the question of voting fraud. I think that Elections Canada does a stand-up job in a lot of ways. We all know that vote buying does go on in certain parts of the country, particularly in some of the northern parts of the prairie provinces. There's no nice way of saying it. I know for a fact that happens in some of those places, and the evidence is there. People want to look for it, but that's more direct vote buying, like somebody like voting in their community because the leader of their community said they'd give them $50 or whatever to vote the right way. But here we are. So Elections Canada is preparing to accept count mail-in ballots received after Election Day. So as we kind of scroll down here, Elections Canada officials are preparing to accept mailed-in ballots a day after polls close should an election be held in 2021. Speaking in the House of Commons and shared by the Blacklock's reporter, Serve MP Marilyn Gladu said, with regard to counting ballots, the polls are closed. Many returning voters told her that the mail ballots would be accepted after polls close on a Monday election. They think they will count them if they show up by Tuesday, Gladu said. Under the current rules outlined in the Canada Elections Act, a vote must be received by the close of polling to be counted. The Liberals, however, are angling to modify the Act through Bill C-19, an act to amend the Canada Elections Act, which would grant permission for returning officers to count ballots after polls are closed. While just over about 50,000 mail-in ballots were counted for the 2019 election, generally from those in military or Canadian citizens living in other countries, the government is anticipating a massive increase in mail-in voting for a potential 2020 election due to ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Explaining this necessary to circulate 5 million mail-in ballots, Privy Council President and Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, Dominic LeBlanc, said in a letter to the House that voting by mail would be a key aspect of running a fair election during the pandemic, while pointing to the ongoing uncertainty surrounding the pandemic and the myriad ways it could unexpectedly affect the rights of electors to vote safely. Well, that was a lot. Let's break that down a little bit. Headline is they're going to take in ballots after the election is over. That's a problem. I mean, we kind of have this thing in BC somewhat, but it isn't that they're received later. They get counted later. So in BC, we have this interesting law where you can vote anywhere. You do not need to vote in your district. You can vote anywhere. And that vote will be counted and added to the tally of the district you belong to. But you can do this at any polling place. I'm just going to double check with my producer on this question. That's a reality, isn't it? You can go to any elections BC office and any polling site and get your ballot filled out. And this is where things do get a little bit not silly in BC, but I mean on election night, if there's a clear majority, there's a clear majority, right? And if there's not enough ballots, because they'll tell you how many ballots are still uncounted. So if you know the difference, right? If you know the uncounted ballots can't sway the election, even if all 100% of them were going to the other candidate, then you know what you're up against, right? So that's over, right? That's done. I think that what we need to understand is that if Elections Canada is really going down this road, we're into dangerous territory, not because we need even a decisive decision on a Monday night necessarily. I mean, I don't really appreciate the fact that the results are decided by the time we get to Toronto, and then the West just kind of has to couple on later. I think there's some ways to reform that issue, and we should think about that. But the bigger question is when is a ballot valid? When is a ballot valid? Because one of the things about time, right? One of the things about time, the idea that minutes and seconds occur and that we live in time and we're not capable of going back in time except through our memories. I know that's some kind of deep philosophical stuff there, but bear with me here for a second. Is that, for example, if a 12-year-old, right? If a 12-year-old starts driving a car and a cop pulls him over and says, you can't drive that car. And the 12-year-old says, well, I'm going to get my license. You're going to receive my license, the application for my license in 4 years. Or if you want to get into the more of a hairline sort of example, it's like somebody who's 15 years old and someone like myself who was 15 years old on December 31st of 2005, right, at 11:59. If I started driving at 11:59, I was doing something illegal. And then at midnight, when I turned 16, let's just pretend that somehow magically the license would appear when I was 16. At least I'd be the correct age. I didn't have my license yet, but because it's a stat holiday, let's all recall. But let's just pretend for a moment I did. At least I'd be the right age. But there is an illegality by that 1/2 second, right? By the half second between 11:59 and the milliseconds left, and the upcoming year for me, who happens to be a New Year's baby, that is an illegal act. And we all know that, and we all understand that, and that's not a question. So how is this any different that a ballot is being received after the polls close? When the polls close, the polls close. Right? If you don't show up to a government office in time to get in the door, when they lock that door, they do not open it up again. They don't make exceptions for you. It's like, no, like those bureaucrats are going home at 4, right? They're going home 4:30, like the door is shut and locked. You line up outside your civil servant office with like lining up with whatever papers you're going to go into, and literally you hear the digital lock click, right? At least if you're in a big enough center that has those sorts of things. But it just when I go down to the BC office or the Government of Canada office and I want to be the first guy in line, well, I got to get there early, and then I sit there and I wait, and I literally hear the door click open, like the electronic lock switches at 8 o'clock on the dot or 8:30 on the dot, whatever it is. We all understand that you can't force the door at 11:59 or at 8:29 in the morning, and you can't force the idea of having your license when you don't have your license, even if you are the proper age. And so I think that something that needs to be noted here is that if you can receive a ballot after the polls close, that's nonsense. I think that also after what we saw in the American election, where there was a lot of spurious activity around voting, and we didn't know who had registered and who had done what. We were talking about this with the census the other day. We have a census form here. Neither of us who live here, because we're just renting here for a short time. We don't have this place as our residence. Like, we're not, like, we may reside here, but this is not technically speaking what's on our driver's licenses. And so the question then becomes very quickly, well, what's what should be on your driver's license, or what should be, like, are we supposed to fill out the census or not? Yes, this is one more door that goes into a residence. I guess that's why the census is on it. You can just you can do that, but why are you posting a census somewhere where someone doesn't live? And I mentioned that our, my beloved's aunt's place, again, property, it's a recreational property. It's not a place people live. They only go there to go on summer holidays. But there was a census there too. So that's a lot of printed paper for nothing. And it's the same thing with the ballot question. How are we going to know that these people are who they are? Who's going to check? How are you going to present the information that proves you are who you are? I think that's something that needs to be talked about. We'll keep trashing the Liberals here. We're going to pivot over again to what's happening in the news. Apparently, the Liberals are, what are they doing? I think they're getting after Bill C-10. They're going to try and censor the internet, and I mean, I might end up being censored by them. I mean, getting canceled. I never thought I'd get canceled by a government. I never thought I would be that important, but I guess that's who I'm going to get canceled by when this bill passes. We have something here from the Nat Poe. We'll take the news first and the commentary second. So for the news, we have that Bill C-10 is happening according to the Liberals. Doesn't address free speech concerns, says an expert. The amendment doesn't come close to their promise on Monday to make it clear the content Canadians upload to social media isn't considered problematic or hateful or whatever. The Liberal government has proposed new limits on how the CRTC can regulate social media posts under Bill C-10, which would still give the broadcast regulator some oversight over what content Canadians see on digital platforms. The amendment proposed at the Heritage Committee meeting Thursday evening would allow the CRTC to issue orders relating to discoverability, the ability to force social media platforms to promote Canadian content to users. Parliamentary Secretary Julie Dabruzen, who introduced the bill, told reporters Friday that would mean the CRTC could make platform suggest content created by Canadians to viewers and listeners. So basically, they're going to try and do the CanCon thing they do with our radio and that sort of thing. They're going to try and do that on online. And it's like, okay, fine. Like, I like, in a sense, like, I'm not okay with any kind of putting your thumb on the scale in Canada when it comes to content or whatever. I don't think something that has a maple leaf should just get more promotion just because it has a maple leaf. At the same time, maybe you should, Oh, this is actually an interesting question. Should you protect your domestic film industry, or like have tariffs on others, or like have subsidies for your own so that you can keep it going? This is a good question. We'll leave that to the comments. What do you guys think we should do with our domestic film industry? I'd be interested to know. Zweibel said if discoverability requirements change, that things will go wrong. She noted that platforms already decide what content to suggest to users, but to have a government telling them what that's supposed to look like is a lack of freedom of expression. She added that the CRTC's order-making power would allow the regulator to, for example, ask that social media services showcase Canadian areas or increase the prominence of Canadian areas as search results can access their post. I think it's all kind of nonsense. So let's back up a moment here and let's think a moment about what the CRTC does right now. So, case in point, local radio show that I help with. I had a brand new panelist. He didn't really know what the protocol was, and he dropped the F-bomb on live radio. Live boomer radio, mind you. So it's not like it was even like university radio. It was like something older people listen to. And you could assume that older people, while they all know what the F word is, probably appreciate it less than us younger people do. Not that anybody should be swearing. But the point is that he said that. And I mean, in America, maybe we would have gotten some nasty letters and even somebody who actually did threaten to call the FCC and sue us or whatever. And maybe the FCC would have been eventually notified and gotten back to us. I have no idea if anyone's ever going to call the CRTC. And even if they did, the CRTC is going to call the producer of that radio show, who is also like the main player there, and say, look, like, we heard this happened. Don't let it happen again. Goodbye. And they're going to hang up the phone. That's also because there's only so many community radio stations in Canada and so many radio stations in Canada and so many TV stations in Canada. So can you imagine trying to do that same kind of regulation. Now, again, not just with swearing, but I mean like with something actually controversial. Could you imagine attempting to regulate that with like little bureaucrats sitting in front of their computers trying to make sure that everything on social media is good? How many people would you need to regulate that? Like, that's a lot of people. How many people are you willing to pay to make sure that nobody's ranting and raving on Facebook and spreading fake news, according to you? And that's the thing too. How do you know what fake news is or not? So this is an interesting, it's an interesting aspect. Like, when you were, let's pretend, and not like I'm using a real life example here or anything, but let's pretend for a moment that you knew somebody who was, involved with the CRA, and they had experience in what the CRA needs to do in order to make sure that, for example, your identity hasn't been stolen. Yeah, not a real life example at all. Anyways, the point is that this person, right, has been trained. And what are they trained to do? Well, they're trained to look at your tax return and see whether or not your deposit information recently changed, right? To see whether or not your addresses match up, to see whether or not there's been consistency of work or like the kind of work you've been doing before. These are all pieces of figuring out whether or not you're a real person. Like whether or not you've had your identity stolen, right? So somebody's faking being you. This is just like, it's basic 101 stuff, right? It's just like if a kid was lying to you, right, about taking something out of the cookie jar, or a student was lying to you about cheating on a test, or your buddy was lying to you about crashing your car or causing damage to your property. Like, you would just do some basic due diligence to kind of think through that problem. It's like, okay, something has gone wrong, or something looks like it might have gone wrong. I'm going to work through this question. Well, it's the same thing with this issue when it comes to censorship. How could a bunch of bureaucrats, and like, they might even be nice people, but like, honestly, do you want someone to sit at a desk all day and look through Facebook to make sure that Facebook is being kind or nice or whatever, and nobody on Facebook is doing anything crazy? I don't. Who could you pay for that, and how many people would it take to look into stuff like that? I guess it could be a reporting model, but then that's exactly the problem. As we go into this other point that was made in the NAPO, commentator by Jamil Giovanni. People really like, for example, they like actually pretty raunchy podcasts nowadays. They like, there's some pretty straight shooters out there in the alternative media world. Technically speaking, I'm one of those people to a point. We don't get super raunchy on this show. I can get quite excited, a little upset, and I can use some pretty strong moral language, but I don't really drop F-bombs or anything on this show, and that's important. But Jamil Giovanni makes the point that Trudeau's censorship agenda could target Joe Rogan, and of course he's using the Joe Rogan reference because Joe Rogan is the biggest name in the world of what I'm doing right now. Right? There's Joe Rogan, there's Steven Crowder, Ben Shapiro, Ted Cruz has got his own thing. They're mostly conservatives or libertarians, which is kind of interesting. There's not a lot of leftists out there doing it, except for that. Not Richard Branson. That's the guy who runs Virgin. Who's that other guy? The English guy that's in Forgetting Sarah Marshall. Can't remember. Anyways, the point is there's a bunch of people on the left as well. There are some hot takes from the left, but there's a lot of hot takes from the right or from the libertarian side. And the point is that, Canada's Heritage Minister, Stephen Guilbeault, has not been shy about admitting he wants to regulate what we say on social media. And Bill C-10 is just the first step, and would mean the government-approved content would be privileged over the videos, podcasts, and posts we actually want to see. So we're going to roll down a little bit to where the point is made about to that pro-life point. So last week we saw a preview of how the Liberals would weaponize this power when Guilbeault was pressed by Lethbridge MP Rachel Harder to answer questions about the constitutionality of Bill C-10. Guilbeault responded by trying to distract the Canadian people with an irrelevant debate about abortion. Given the opportunity, Guilbeault said Harder would not hesitate one moment to remove a woman's right to choose, a right protected under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but would like us and Canadians to believe she cares deeply about the Charter. So might pro-life political opinions, a favorite target of the Trudeau Liberals, be censored on social media if Guilbeault has his way? If the minister is willing to use the abortion debate to divide and conquer Canadians on matters of free speech, then we can expect that they may use similar tactics in the future to manipulate the internet in their favor. The point that I'm trying to draw here is that, it's kind of simple, really. I mean, ultimately, and the point that's being drawn by this author, the internet's too big is basically the point. The internet's too big. How could you have everybody watching it all the time? You just can't. It's not possible. There it is. Alan Pamberg got it. Yep, Russell Brand. That's right. That was what it was. That's why I got it wrong with Richard Branson. That's because there's some similar stuff going on there. But yeah, Russell Brand, the other guy who's on the left, who does hot takes from the left and kind of mostly uncensored, talks to actual people from the right and stuff. The point is this, that the internet's too big to regulate. It's just way too big. It's kind of like human life, right? Like the best thing you can do for humans walking around doing their own thing is teach them to have some morals and ethics, and that way they self-regulate, because there just aren't enough police on planet Earth to take care of all the police, right? And to take care of all the policing. That just can't be done. So one of the things with this censorship thing that's coming out of the Liberal government that's extremely dangerous, in my opinion, is precisely this. There isn't enough hours in the day, there aren't enough people in the day to get this done. You can't count every single Facebook post. It's just not going to happen. So what you're going to end up having to do is clamping down on, I guess, offenders that you know already, people known to police, known to the Facebook police, right? And now our own regulators. So another layer of regulation, because Facebook already has Facebook police and Facebook jail. So I guess we have another now government-funded Facebook police and Facebook jail. Why we're working so closely with a multinational from another country that's one of the largest companies in the world, that is all about private equity and helping its shareholders. I don't like. That's a for-profit company. Why we're doing their work for them, I don't know. But apparently the government of Canada has decided that they're going to partner with Facebook to be co-Facebook police. Anyways, here's the point. The point is that as we kind of roll, especially into what Nadine's going to be talking about to us in a second here, is that censorship is on the rise. And the danger with that, of course, is that if you don't get to hear all the ideas, even the crazy ones, you don't get to make your own choices. That's life. So the more ideas you have access to at any one time, just like the more information you have access to at any one time, allows you to filter through the information yourself, the ideas yourself, the opinions yourself, and come to your own conclusions. If that's being taken from you, then you're only getting one side of the story. And it's a really good divide and conquer tactic, because the fact of the matter is that if you can't have a right-wing and left-wing columnist in the same paper, or if you can't have right-wing and left-wing people on the same TV show, if that just doesn't happen, and if only one opinion is prized over another opinion, and that opinion is always somehow pro-corporate, pro-government, pro-big spending, pro whatever weird social thing we're doing today when it comes to social progressivism, and the next bizarre acronym that's being invented for the next bizarre kind of non-normative behavior, this is nonsense. So the point is that if the Liberals are successful in putting this through, we're in deep trouble, deep trouble, and we've got to do something about that. So we're going to bring Nadine on now, and we're going to talk to her a little bit about what's happening in Alberta. Nadine, welcome to the program. Of course, you're an independent journalist in Alberta, and you are with us at the Western Standard as well, at least getting on with us in time. And we are happy to have you here today in order to tell us about what happened with the rodeo and what's happening around Alberta when it comes to lockdown. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Well, what happened?
Where do we start? Do you want the whistle stop or the no more lockdowns? Let's start with the rodeo. So
Sure.
Mr. Guy Northcott was the event organizer and coordinator for the No More Lockdowns rodeo in just outside of Bowden on his own private property. And he just received his summons yesterday to appear in court in Red Deer on May 17th. And he's being charged under the Public Health Act. And of course, there's potentially some pretty hefty fines associated with that. So it's not only he was served, but his wife, and of course his company was named as well. So he received 3 summons, compliments of the RCMP yesterday.
Mm-hmm. Well, beautiful.
It's a new Canada.
I don't really know where I live anymore. I thought I lived in a country where, like, honestly, the RCMP, as bothersome as they could be, couldn't be bothered to come bother me with this sort of stuff. But apparently they can. So that's a new one. That's a new one. I would have thought they would have had to get the Alberta sheriffs to do it, but oh well.
Well, what's interesting is, and Mr. John Carpe actually touched on this as he was covering some of the events around the whistle stop, the injunction that they actually managed to get to prevent the whistle stop protest actually implicates pretty much every Albertan that was in attendance that was aware of this. Every John Doe, Jane Doe, was named. If you just attended, you could have been charged and taken away. Mm-hmm. This is abuse of the courts. This is not using the law for what the law was intended. This is a perversion of the law. And Frederic Bastiat actually spoke a lot about legal plunder and the abuse of government officials. And I can't stress enough that injunction that was held at the whistle stop and ordered by the courts. Now the courts are being used as enforcement instead of the protection of people's rights and freedoms.
Yeah, treating their exercise of their constitutional rights as crimes punishable by court order, right, and by indictment. We must remember, and this is actually good that we're going to have Stuart back on here later this week. For those of us who've been watching for a little while, we've had Stuart Parker on here a few times. A guy way out in left field, nowhere near us on the political spectrum, who I'm speaking to right now, and myself. But the reason that I really enjoy having Stuart on here is he helps explain some of these things. And it's good solidarity, because if we're going to have the West be the best, we need to reach across the aisle. But he explains in no uncertain terms how this injunction stuff works. So I'm going to try and rehash it here, but he'll do a better job in 2 days. So what people need to understand about injunctions is that it's an offense against the sanctity of the court itself. So you haven't trespassed a law, okay? You've not trespassed a law. You have trespassed the court itself, which is to say Her Majesty and all of the power that she's endowed with, represented by the judges of our country. And so you can imagine that could carry some pretty heavy weight. In fact, there are no caps to the sentencing that can come out of a contempt of court charge for a trespassing an injunction, because you are, again, trespassing the court. And as Stuart pointed out last week, it's actually one of the few offenses you can still be executed for in this country. There's mutiny and contempt of court / injunctions, trespassing injunctions. So the point being that he noted, just as Nadine was noting here, that he actually had to represent to whom it may concern, to John Doe and Jane Doe and others. So he represented all unnamed people and others when he was brought before the courts back in the 90s. And he had quite a bit of fun representing all these unnamed people as himself. I am the unnamed, and going back and forth with the judge about what exactly this had to do with anything. So if anybody's looking for a legal strategy, call yourself the unnamed. I am Spartacus, and just go that route. So Nadine, have you been named in this? Like, what's going to happen?
Well, I was attending the event as the journalist for the Western Standard. So I have not, as far as I'm aware, been named, and I haven't had any RCMP present me with anything. But, it'll be interesting to see. They were handing out a number of tickets at the event after the fact. And in the beginning, because part of this injunction was you had to be aware of it. So in the beginning, the RCMP were actually going around handing out a notice. So it was like trying to make people aware. And of course, people were just refusing to take it, which was the right thing for them to do. But the amount of police officers and the show of force, this really, for me, became the first event that I've attended that I took a step back and went, this is getting very real. They were there, such a large number and such a big presence. It was really an intimidation tactic. And then to have 3 arrests made, in Alberta on that same day, Pastor Artur Pawlowski, whether, you think he's radical or not, he still is a pastor. That's the second pastor in Alberta that's been, I don't know of anywhere in the world other than Alberta, Canada, that has arrested a pastor through all of this. And we've arrested 2. And James Coates, he's a lamb, the most gentile, peaceful man, and Art is the lion in this for sure. And then, of course, Glenn Carrott was arrested as well. No one's talking about that. And, of course, Chris Scott, just a business owner, trying to keep his business alive, be there for his community, put food on the the table for his family. And these are the criminals now that we're dedicating our resources and hunting down.
I mean, this is precisely it when it comes to this question of criminality. Like the things have been inverted. Things have been completely inverted. So to sit at home and not do anything is somehow a virtue, while to go and try and make a living is somehow a vice and something that must be corrected. And simultaneously as well, especially when we talk about small business people who are losing their livelihood, what other choice do they have? They can't wait for another government subsidy to come through and take care of the day. In the end, they have to make it pay, or else they're still paying rent and they're still paying heating, and this isn't going to pay if they can't make money at their jobs.
Well, it's not only that, it's the goalpost consistently moves. There's no, okay, well, if we hit this target, then this. Well, if we hit that target, or sometimes even if we don't, there's a new restriction that's put into place. So, for example, with the last series of restrictions that Jason Kenney put into place, he said outdoor patios were fine. So you have and have you seen the price of lumber lately? All of these small business owners that go out and they upgrade their patios, it's an extra expense that they, at this particular time, cannot afford. And then literally weeks later, he says, no, changed our mind. How is that even fair? How do you run a business when you don't know from day to day what the government is going to throw at you?
And I mean, I'm sorry, but this is queuing something up for me in the sense that one of the places that I've had a lot of fun is trying to explain to people that they lost the rights to their face when the government banned smoking indoors. That's just been one of my rants that I've gone over again and again. This is not a promotion of smoking in general or an endorsement that smoking is just fine. That's not the point. The point is the idea that the government could literally regulate the air you breathe in a private business or in your private car. Should you smoke with your kids in the car? Probably not. But again, the idea that the government could regulate that has become completely pervasive through society. And there you are. So why can't the government put a mask on your face? And to your point exactly with the patio thing, in British Columbia, they said that if you built smoke cancellation systems, people would be allowed to smoke inside. 6 months later, they changed the rule after everybody upgraded, or shortly after everybody upgraded. So the people who wanted to upgrade did. They built rooms where there was a big fan and there was smoke cancellation. They never got a cent back at the PST they paid on that ducting. They never got a cent back on the renovations. They didn't get a write-off. They didn't get to count it as a loss. The government just changed the rules. So to your same point here, arbitrary government rules that don't necessarily square with science or reason or just how you run a business, changing all of a sudden. This has been going on a long time. It's been going on since the 90s. Well, even earlier in many respects. But I mean, in this kind of public health sense, it's been going on since the 80s and 90s.
Well, what we have is a nanny state. And what we're seeing is that nanny state is actually graduating now to more of a police state. And the enforcement of government rules, legal or otherwise, because, we have an amazing group of lawyers in this province in particular that are really standing up and pointing out the violations to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Bill of Rights, our Constitution. And, what's really, for me, somewhat shameful is our media is not covering that. And the media has really been the biggest, I think, spreading the fear of COVID. And that's given the government more power to come out with what they're doing. And it's about objectivity. And you said this just a moment ago, everybody needs to see both sides of the story. So people often look at me and go, Nadine, well, you have an opinion. Of course I do. But I also want to make sure that both sides of the story are being heard. CTV, TV, Global, CBC, they do a good job at covering, the other side. And they're bought and paid for. It's state propaganda, in my opinion. And there's nobody that's talking about where's the evidence. So, for example, I just had a call this morning with Mr. Northcott, the Lockdown Rodeos event coordinator, and that was a protest. That was a protest against these draconian measures that the government is taking. And like he said, he's looking forward to his day in court, but his concern now also is that he gets a fair judge. Because, we had a judge who put an injunction in place, unnamed people, right? Anybody could go to prison, because they simply decided to show up at a protest, which is legally within their right to do so. And that's his biggest concern. So people are not afraid to stand up for their rights. They're not afraid to go to jail, as Chris Scott had made mention at the whistle stop. He's not afraid to go to jail. His biggest concern right now is the apathy of Canadian people. People are sitting at home on their sofas and letting this happen. And there was a great sign, and I know it's been going around on Facebook, and I'm going to reference Anne Frank, because, the people who hid her were breaking the law. The people who killed her were following orders. And right now, again, my opinion, but this is not the time to be complying and following orders. We need to question what is going on. We need to demand the evidence. Show us the evidence. People are not unreasonable. But when you ask people to go through what they have gone through for the last 15 months, when they were told it was going to be 2 weeks, and they have never seen evidence. And the Pastor Coates trial was very interesting, because they were asked to produce evidence and they said they didn't have enough time. Well, in circumstances where you're drawing upon a pandemic, emergency measures like this, you are supposed to have done the due diligence, have the evidence before you put the measures in place. And here we are 15 months later, they're going to court and they say, sorry, we don't have enough time.
Don't have enough time. I'm pretty sure that in order to charge someone, you need the evidence to charge them. That's the founding rule of English-speaking justice. Habeas corpus produce the body. In any case, I think something else that's kind of also interesting is that the attitude that's kind of been taken. It's not that BC doesn't have any enforcement of the restrictions, but it's interesting that BC, which is definitely more irreligious than Alberta, is somehow not, I think, as far as I know, I'd have to check in some places. There's definitely been some crackdowns in some of the churches and whatever. I don't think we're rounding up pastors, though. What do you think's going on in Alberta? Which, I mean, especially from the liberal side of Canada, the eastern side, they would say, well, Alberta's a bunch of Bible thumpers. Why is Alberta having a problem with its pastors in a way that BC isn't?
Well, I think Alberta is... I think Alberta probably represents the most conservative voice in Canada.
I agree.
That's a real threat to the Liberal, the left, to the Trudeau government in particular. And I think Jason Kenney, and I don't understand the rationale, but he's really taken offense to people not obeying his orders. And he is hiding behind Dr. Hinshaw and has said, it's not my fault. It's AHS who's doing this. But I'm going, you have to come back and say, excuse me, but are you not the premier? So, I know Horgan has certainly put Bonnie Henry out front, but he has made it also very clear that they are not going to take these enforcement measures like you've seen here in Alberta. So it is a great question. Why such a tough, and I think it's because, Albertans, the rodeo, the police did not show up at rodeo. Could you imagine the confrontation of a bunch of cowboys? And I mean, you go back to the days of cowboys and Indians, really. And it would not, I don't think, have ended in anything productive. So smart on them. But I mean, they're arresting people, Pastor Pelosi, in the middle of 17th Avenue. I mean, that didn't even look safe to me, not for the police officer, and especially for Pastor Pelosi, who was on his knees in the middle of one of the busiest streets we have in Calgary. Why? This is such a demonstration of force and coercion, and I think it's a scare tactic. Albertans, get in line, smarten up.
And smarten up to what end? This is the thing that's really confusing to me. To what end? the pandemic is supposed to end. It's not supposed to go on.
A virus does not go away. So Dr. Modry and Dr. Joffrey, Dr. Hodkinson, they've all made this very clear. I mean, we have a flu that reoccurs every year, except for when there's COVID. And it's a virus. It is going to constantly mutate. It doesn't go away. Measles has never gone away. Chickenpox has never gone away. This is not going away. So what? Now is it the government's expectation that you have to wear a mask over your face for the rest of your life? And the other thing that people aren't talking about, and the government has been very, curt to deny, is the collateral damage that Colonel Redmond speaks about. And the collateral damage is a military term because people don't want to talk about, the deaths that are caused by government decisions. So we don't call it deaths or the harm. We call it collateral damage. The suicides. So in Mirror at the whistle stop, interestingly enough, there was an individual who stood up there and spoke of the 3 suicides that have happened in Mirror since this lockdown has begun. 3 in a little tiny community that has not been impacted by COVID. Not 1 death in Mirror from COVID, but now 3 suicides. So you tell me what's more deadly.
This is something that's becoming very apparent in British Columbia as well. My own father is a psychiatrist. Technically speaking, he's an adolescent psychiatrist, but here in northern British Columbia, you do the work they got. But the thing that he's observed is that he usually gets a couple of suicide attempts in a year. He's had record numbers over the last 15 months, record numbers of suicide attempts, and of course in BC, the real pandemic, the real epidemic, is of course the opiate crisis. I was just finishing up a column on this morning. I needed to beef it up a little bit, and it had to do with Ali Thomas out of Victoria, who of course was 12 when she died of opiate overdose last month.
Well, what's really happening to our children is such, that's criminal. I have a 9-year-old little daughter, and it's taking its toll on her. We're trying to keep things as normal as we possibly can, and she's hearing what's going on. She's seeing what's going on. The limits that are placed upon her as far as what she can do with her friends and who she can see. It really, this is decades to correct what is happening. And I also too have a friend of mine who is a doctor, mental health, and his practice right now is open 7 days a week. He has never seen the amount of traffic and the need. And that's why he said he's open 7 days a week. Why? Because he needs to be right now.
It's pretty incredible, really, if you think about it. And then let's think about that collateral damage. We have a socialized medical system in Canada. That doctor is billing for those, and that's fine. That's the nature of our system. But if that frequency has gone up that much, those billings have gone up that much. That's more money from the taxpayer that's gone up that much. If that's not just an isolated incident, if that's every other little town and every other part of the urban areas we have in this country, you can imagine that we're not just spending money we don't have out there on various projects or wasteful projects or COVID restrictions. We're also now billing for money we don't have. Again, it's not to say anyone who has a right to bill shouldn't bill. It's to say that if that frequency goes up, like any actuary, I'm no actuary and I have no time for actuaries. I think it's a dismal profession. But the idea, you do assess things. You make a guesstimate. We all make guesstimates about how much further we need to go until we need to refill our truck. We all make guesstimates all the time. If your guesstimate is that off, right, and if it keeps being that off, you're going to be in a big hole of public debt very quickly. With no light at the end of the tunnel.
Well, it's okay because, according to the Trudeau government, budgets balance themselves and we'll just print more money. It is tragic, actually, what's happened. And I attribute this to the education system. For the last 30 years, I think our children have been more indoctrinated and instructed as opposed to educated. And regrettably, they don't understand or know history, and they know nothing of finance. When I talk to people, we'll just print more money, millennials, they'll just print more money. Well, it doesn't work that way. We're going to see inflation happen. And people go, well, inflation, we can't control that. Well, so being a chartered investment manager, I love talking to people about money in such a way that they can understand. Well, when you print more of something, it has lesser value. So prices go up. Inflation is not the cause of anything other than it's the symptom of the government printing more money. And so they are directly responsible for paying more at the pumps. They are directly responsible for you having to pay more in the grocery store. Every purchase you make, lumber, groceries, housing, this is all government's doing because they are printing more money.
It is. It is. At the same time, I think something we actually have to face facts when it comes to, say, the interest rate as well. We've been lowering the interest rate for a very long time to the point where it's basically negligible. And of course, that's causing people to take out big loans because it's cheap to take out the big loan. And that's causing housing prices to rise as well. And God knows what that's doing to our inflation as well. And now we're in a trap where if we can't raise the interest rate in order to try and cool things or to try and bring the cost of a $1 up versus having to pay $30 for $1, right, in inflation, we have a problem because people won't be able to afford their payment. So we're stuck at the bottom of this very bad fiscal hole. The policy that we were following fiscally for the last 10 years has not gone well, basically ever since 2008. We had great policy into 2008 to a point because we didn't have the crash the United States had. But since then, for some reason, we've been following a very bad set of policies that at this point, if we raise interest rates, people will literally be out of house and home in a matter of minutes.
But we have to go back to what's the underlying cause? What's the underlying factor here? And that's government. The government interferes in pretty much every aspect of people's personal lives today, whether it's how much water comes out of your shower, through to building codes, which represent here, and I know Alberta, almost 1/3 the cost of a home here is directly related to regulation and meeting the bureaucratics, the requirements. And the government has gotten to the point where it's the nanny state. They figure they have to take care of everyone and everything in every aspect. We're not responsible adults. And this is where people have to stop making demands on the government to do something and recognize that every time you do that, you give up a little bit more freedom and a little bit more power, and they are happy to take it. But it does not serve you. And when the government puts something into law, it doesn't only impact one person or the group, it impacts everybody. And, I have a different level of risk than most people. I have, bungee jumped. I have jumped out of airplanes. I was a mountaineer and a rock climber. Most people would think that's crazy, but I'm still here today. And yet I went for a walk in the woods just last year and went into full anaphylaxis and shock because I got stung 9 times by a wasp's nest. So we take risks every day, and we need to be able to judge for ourselves what risks we want to take. Most people would never take the risk of being a business owner. Why? They prefer the security of going to work at 8, coming home at 4. Everything is very predictable. They know what they're getting paid. They can budget accordingly. When you're a business owner, you don't know what's coming at you from one day to the next with the market. But now to add a government that is just throwing restrictions and regulations and that not even ones that they're willing to explain from a rational perspective. I mean, that's not a free society. I'm sorry, but we have to admit what we're living with right now. And it's not, the courts are not upholding freedoms. They're not upholding the Charter of Rights. And I always tell people our legal system is founded on the supremacy that we are born with inalienable rights. Government didn't give us these rights. Government's job is to protect these rights. And they're the ones trampling all over them.
They are supposed to protect those rights. And I think that a huge part of it is that government is just so distant from us today. There's millions of people, even in Canada, which is a small population, but there's still millions of people. and they aren't directly connected to their representatives anymore. They don't know who they are. They can't pass them in the street and give them a wave. They're not from your neighborhood. You don't know who's actually in charge. And that anonymity creates a huge amount of confusion and resentment. It creates a fog of war around policy. And finally, something that I addressed in my opening statement this morning is that the idea of commission government, actually another subject that Stuart Parker likes to dwell on, and we'll talk to him more about that on Thursday, but commission government is a dangerous thing because ultimately it subtracts the very idea that kind of rules in monarchy especially, but in any kind of system, which is like, well, you are what you do, and it is your honor that's going to kind of keep you accountable, right? That simple premise. It's like we have an honor-based system. You what you do is who you are, and what you are is what will be judged, and we expect that you care about that enough that you'll act accordingly. So we have accountability. But when we did the commission government system, when we gave so much power to bureaucrats, because we had seen politicians help themselves to the cookie jar and make sure that fire departments were in their neighborhood and not in someone else's. So we saw that lack of disinterest. We saw people doing things selfishly. We said, well, we'll give it to this group of people that'll always act unselfishly. And it's like, well, they're people, and people can make mistakes. People are always fallible. And I think we're at the height of it when it comes to COVID. It is the inmates running the asylum. The civil servants are running the government. They're running the country. The elected officials have completely abandoned the ship to the point where they don't even go to parliament anymore or the legislatures. They don't even show up. If we were going to, like where they're not even at work.
And isn't that amazing? Because these are the people that in a crisis, we did elect them to be able to responsibly make decisions for us quickly and efficiently and effectively. And they're hiding in their basements. So what happens if Canada actually did see a war? Mr. Kenney came out just a few days ago, May 8th, Europe Victory Day. And the comments that if you go to that tweet and you read the comments, people are very angry. He right now does not understand what freedom is. Right. And then to come out and say, oh, this is a wonderful day to be celebrated freedom. And the role that Canadians played in that is an insult and a slap in the face to Albertans and to all Canadians. Because if you live in a free society, the government respects the individual's rights. We are not a collective. You and I, may share 95% of the same and then 5% different. But myself and someone else may be 50% different. And that's the beauty of a free society. We are allowed to use our own faculties, our own property in the way that serves us the greatest. And the law's purpose is to protect those rights. And then more importantly, allow us to do that. But the catch is it comes with individual responsibility. You as an adult are responsible for the actions that you take. And the law is force 100% all the time. So the only purpose for us to have laws is to make sure that I do not infringe upon your freedoms. You do not infringe upon mine. First, do no harm in the Hippocratic Oath for medicine. It's no different. And right now, it is the government seems to have assumed that they have all these powers that they actually don't have. They only have the power of an individual because it's our power that we give them.
It is our power that we give them. And what needs to be understood is that the government is not the repository of our rights. That's our own dignity given to us by God. But they are the guarantor. And if the guarantor can't be trusted to guarantee anymore, then it must be ousted. And I think that's what's going to end up happening. It's somewhat regrettable to me. I worked with Mr. Kenney. He was then Minister Kenney, very briefly in Ottawa. I was an intern in his office. I had a lot of respect for him, and I thought he was a very competent, intelligent guy. I just don't know. I don't know what's going on in Alberta. That's not the Jason Kenney I knew in Ottawa. And I don't understand what's happening over there. It's troubling, to put it politely. It seems very caustic, and it seems very random. It seems very panicked, and just like grasping at straws. And I hope things come together for the premier, because he's just clearly out of sorts. That's all the time we have for today, Nadine. We'll check in with you again. We'd like to have you on regularly if you would be interested. I'm sure that we could bring you on regularly, and that would be great to have your contributions as you're out there on the ground, talking to people, bringing them on, talking to them on film, and getting them on record as saying what they think of these lockdowns and what they're really what they're fighting for every day.
Well, I can assure you, they're not unhinged conspiracy theorists, and they're certainly not white nationalist supremacists that some of our political class have claimed them to be. They're just everyday working moms and dads trying to earn an honest living.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nadine, and we will talk with you again soon. Well, we're going to be bringing President Sheldon Clare onto the stream now. We, of course, got him from the National Firearms Association, and he is here to tell us all about what is going on in Canada when it comes to both people's just rights, everyday rights, as well as their gun rights. What is happening?
Well, hi, Nathan. It's glad to be here again. I see you're having a great day in Prince George. Looking out my window, I see the same. What's happening? Well, the NFA just had its annual general meeting last weekend. We had members participating from all over Canada, and we've got a lot of business done. Went through our financials, discovered we have a bit of money that we can spend, and so we've allocated a good bit of our funding towards fighting the next federal election. We're going to be going after specific ridings to make sure that those who do not support our particular goals and agenda are defeated soundly in the next election. We're looking at narrow gaps, and we're looking at spending probably close to a fifth of our annual budget on this, and it's a significant chunk of money, I can tell you, when you're looking at an organization that's a multi-million-dollar group. So we're doing that. We passed a motion to condemn the Liberal government for the treatment of firearms owners over many years. That was a resounding support. We've been engaged in a major fundraising campaign, which also sought the views of members and supporters with regards to condemning the Liberals, and our response has been tremendous. And I really want to thank all of those of our listeners out there who are members of the NFA and supporters and who have donated and helped us out. We've got a really unprecedented time in front of us here. I mean, I'm a historian. I look at pandemics in history. I've done that a little bit, and typical pandemics, 3 to 5 years, maybe as long as 14. But what we're seeing here is not the 1918 to 1922, 50 million people dead pandemic. That's not what's going on here. And I think that in the initial stages of this, there was a lot of fear as to what this was going to be shaping out to and what it looks like. And I think that we've really turned a corner on that, and we should be changing our views. And the fact that we haven't is very disconcerting to a lot of Canadians, including firearms owners, as to what's going on really. So I think these are all issues of concern for us. Our legislative efforts continue with our active lobbying. We have Charlie Zatch, who's busy meeting with members of Parliament, senators, various bureaucrats to ensure that our views are well in front of their agendas. And I'm proud to say that we are far in excess the most prolific and highest quality lobbying organization fighting for firearms rights in the country, where there's nobody even close to us. So I'm very, very pleased about that. And we're continuing our efforts in a major fashion to make sure that we're getting our views out there and correcting misinformation. In the court and legal front, we are funding the CASI PREMAC and KKS Tactical versus Canada case, which is a focus to go after very directly the government's assertion that banning 1,500 types of firearms was reasonable and necessary in Canada. And we're fighting that quite hard. We have a hearing coming up on the intervention that we are also doing. We're doing an intervention as well as funding that main case. We certainly didn't want to be the gun lobby versus Canada. We don't see that as a very productive or compelling client to put in front of a federal court. But we were the first to file with the PREMAC matter, and we're very careful about developing an effective strategy with our legal team to make sure we had the best chance of victory. We did not choose to go for an injunction to delay the time. If we were going to do that, our view was that we should be doing it towards a time when there is a pressure on the time left for the case, because our concerns were that there would be attempts to make arguments that would affect the main case, and that perhaps tipping strategy hands was not a very good idea early on. We felt the whole exercise would be a waste of money. Unfortunately, it was, but we did not participate in that as we saw what was going to happen. So that's a lot of what we're doing right now, Nathan, and we're trying to keep up on things. We're very, very active. We're developing our communication strategy for the federal election, and we're gonna make a big difference.
With a mind to the federal election, we had all predicted that it was going to come down this May and this June. It was going to be a late spring, summer election. And then suddenly that reversed. Now everybody's kind of saying the fall. Why do you think that changed? What was the difference there?
Well, I think it can be pretty much explained by the lockdowns in Ontario and Quebec in particular, and the continued COVID cavitation, I guess, of the rest of the country. When you start seeing pastors rousted on the street by police, when you start seeing communities being shut down, people not being able to buy clothing for their children, and a whole host of other issues happening, I think that politically is a dangerous ground for any government to say, well, we're going to have an election. I think what's going to happen in the Trudeau Parliament is that they're going to have to say, okay, well, we're going to stop the lockdowns and we're going to open it up so we can have an election. And it seems to me that with lockdowns in place, they're not going to be able to do it. The problem they have is, how do you get there from here? You see, they've created such a strong state of fear in society right now that to all of a sudden say, oh, it's okay now, a lot of people are vaccinated or something and it's all right, so we're all good to go, and that's it. That isn't going to be very credible to people, especially those who they've convinced of their particular political point of view on this. So people are still going to be concerned. They're still going to be worried about their personal safety and the safety of their loved ones, and they're not really going to be sure what to believe and what to trust, because when the government's been saying, well, you have to do these, this, that, and the other, and all these harsh measures, and then all of a sudden they're going to have to say it's okay so we can do an election. Well, that's not going to really fly very well. So it's a how do you get there thing, I think.
And how do we get there? The issue is that, as we see with the lockdowns throughout Alberta and in BC and out into Ontario and Quebec, people are growing very tired of this. But at the same time, we've had a COVID election here in BC that resulted in the NDP gaining a defining majority, a definitive victory over the Liberals, a serious smash. And on it goes. So as we look around the country, I believe there's only been one upset. I believe everything else has stayed the same. So the government currently in charge has stayed. The upset, I believe, was Newfoundland, was it not, by 1 or 2 seats?
Well, I think historically the trend is for people to seek stability in times of instability. And so there's often a resistance to change government and there's a whole bunch of things going on that people are concerned about. I get that. But I think there's also a concern that this is not being operated in a very good manner for the country or the people in it. There's a lot of anger out there. There's a lot of people who are starting to engage in large protests. You're seeing significant numbers of people who are getting fed up with this and saying they're mad as hell and they're not going to take it anymore. And I think that is going to not get smaller. That's growing, and it's growing every day. And I mean, I'm coming from the firearms point of view. We're seeing a legislative agenda in which they basically are saying that it's not okay to own guns, period, full stop, regardless of why you have them. We're seeing attacks on hunting activities in British Columbia and in other areas of the country. We're seeing attacks on firearms owners generally. people are saying, well, hunting rifles are all that are okay, but not these so-called scary modern sporting rifles. Well, hang on a second here. This is about all of that, and you can rest assured that if they're after your hunting, they're after your hunting rifles and shotguns as well. And an awful lot of people who own firearms don't hunt with them. They use them for sporting purposes, which include competitive shooting, recreation, collecting, reenactment, and so on. And I know many who don't hunt at all. So it's not just about that aspect of things. So there's an awful lot going on, Nathan, an awful lot. And when you start adding it all up, the government's starting to say, hey, we're coming after your guns. We want you to be fully controlled in your environment and where you live and how you live. And we're playing games about election dates. That's cause for concern.
There's a little bit of cause for concern, isn't it? Just a little bit. A civil disarmament agenda coupled with growing government tyranny always goes well in the end.
Not historically. It sure doesn't.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. The issue seems to be, and it was actually brought up by Nadine in the last segment here, that honestly, there seems to be a lack of education around these issues, a lack of knowledge around these issues, lack of facts, a lot of fake news from the opposite side, the side that always accuses the other of fake news. It's actually mostly coming from them. And so on this issue, as someone who is a historian and somebody who teaches history for a living, what do you find? Are people very well informed about what happened before and why things happened and why they might happen again?
Well, I think when you're close to the fire, your perspective is different than when you look back at things with hindsight and knowing what the outcomes are. And I think the thing about asking a historian a question like that is we're not very good at predicting the past. So, our crystal ball is not so good for predicting the future. However, when you look at pandemics historically, they tend to go about 3 to 5 years, sometimes as long as about 14. They are big events. And this is not the 1918 to 1922 global pandemic that killed 50 million people. This is clearly not that. We're seeing nowhere near the fluctuation of numbers or change. And I think at the start of this, there was some cause for legitimate concern. But that maybe figuring out how to dial that back hasn't been going so well. Mm-hmm. Maybe there's some of them that seem to like the power this has given them. It's not good.
With respect to government power, is there a way to curtail it? Is there a way to kind of push back against it? I suppose some of these protests that are being organized and people are standing up. Even the platform that we're on right now, there's been some very clear lines drawn and some clear things said. At the same time, obviously the governments are still holding sway, and I don't know how many of them have been backed down and backed into their corner and told to stay where they belong and to stay out of people's lives and to stop regulating them at this micro level. Is there going to be a change in that, or are people finally going to get fed up and tell the government that's it, we're just not going to comply anymore?
Well, I think until you have mass movements that say no, it's going to be a problem. We're living in a society right now where professional associations, medical professional associations, were given letters by provincial governments and their health authorities telling them how they were going to be speaking and talking and what to say and what not to say about the whole pandemic thing. They were given very clear directions, coupled with a threat of potential loss of revenue, licensing, hospital visiting privileges, and so on. I've seen some of these documents, and I think doctors who are looking at this have been muzzled. I think that there is a lot of concern about the whole loss of income, loss of revenue. If you take a stand, you're smashed. And there's this general marketing that goes on where everything's been repeated over and over again, and the package has been sold, and people are buying it. There's legitimate cause for some concern here. This isn't a complete, isn't a fantasy, but the using a sledgehammer to kill a mosquito is something that is what this really starting to look like.
That's always bad policy. I made a reference earlier in my opening statement that argument with government, discussion with government is always a hostage situation. What do we need to offer is there a way to negotiate this? Is there a way to try and get them to get off of the high horse of incompetence and arrogance and not wanting to acknowledge that they've made mistakes, and just get them to kind of switch around and say, oh, well, we were always going to give you your freedoms back, and just move on? And maybe that's their absolution. It's just like, well, you just gave it back, so we'll just move on, and we'll all just pretend this didn't happen.
Well, I think you have to get involved in politics. And I mean, if you don't get involved in politics, you are going to be ruled and governed by those who are involved in politics. And there's the time for being peaceful and doing all of that and trying to make that work. And if you run into true tyranny and the jackboot and the iron heel and all the rest of it, well, then maybe you have to step the game up a different way. But I think we're not at that right now. Where we are is where people need to be getting involved in politics, getting involved with changing minds, making sure they become informed themselves with credible information. There's a lot of information out there that's pretty screwy on all sides, and I mean, you have a range, and somewhere in that range is fact, and sifting the facts out from the fantasy is a challenge for everyone right now, especially given the large access to information that we are all enjoying, until that gets shut down with C10, because we might say things that are unpopular, or maybe Mr. Trudeau doesn't like NFA cartoons that we've been putting out that you can see on our website at nfa.ca. We have a pretty good collection of cartoons which we think are pretty hard-hitting and blunt and accurate.
Speaking of Bill C10, this is where things get kind of hairy very quickly. Who has even the budget to police all of Facebook and YouTube and all the social media sources? Canada doesn't have the budget to do that, to duplicate the police that already exists there in those social media platforms. And furthermore, who decides what is to be censored? What is fair content? What's fair?
Well, that's the scary thing. Right now, you have social media platforms themselves, which are engaged in basically what I regard as political activity to go after particular groups. I mean, firearms groups, firearms pages, and so on Facebook in particular are under a great deal of pressure and under scrutiny by Facebook. Facebook will shut you down pretty quickly on complaint-driven matters. I know in NFA we're very vigilant about what goes on to our particular groups and our page to make sure that we are attempting to be within the parameters of what's okay from their perspective. But at some point that we're not going to be okay. And, we're seeing all kinds of conservative, right of center, libertarian, freedom believing groups being shut down on a regular basis, or being shadow banned, where your reach has been severely curtailed, particularly if you're getting viral type posts out there that might offend progressive sensibilities.
And of course, it always does seem to go one way. Though the statist, progressivist, power hungry people in the world, they're very happy to eat their own the moment that they wander off the reservation. The moment that somebody says, I do have questions about the AstraZeneca vaccine because I know someone who suffered from it and that wasn't good. The moment you say that and you are a part of the elite that's there, you're devoured. Right?
Oh, so yeah, they turn on you right away. I have friends in the medical professions who've experienced very much this kind of mobbing or dossing, or where they come out with a view that isn't in sync with the popular the popular line, and they're all of a sudden turned upon and devoured. And it seems to be almost a professional attribute in healthcare in many respects, where it's practice credibility or something, or they look at me and say, well, you're violating your practice ethics or something, and they go after you on that. I don't know. I think we've really gotten into the Chinese curse of living in interesting times, Nathan.
Yes, that's that I remember that being said to me every morning by the formerly Marxist, now paleocon professor that we had on here not so long ago, Dr. Grant Havers. May you live in interesting times.
Yeah, the old Chinese curse.
Yeah, he was a very good. He did a very good job of explaining to us like the history of ideas. He was a philosophy professor, and we'll have him on the show again. There is some questions, I guess, around, is this the Canada that anybody ever thought they'd live in? I'm trying to imagine explaining this to someone in 2018, even late 2019, even the beginning of 2020, and trying to explain to someone that, yeah, Canada is headed into this very tyrannous state, and we're not going to be a free people in a few short months. I don't know if anybody would have believed me. But
Oh,
but
I quite agree. I mean, can you imagine going back and telling people who were signing up to fight in World War II that in another 75 or 80 years that this kind of thing was going to be going on in their country?
mhm.
You know, there might have affected some of their decisions about which way they were flying the Lancasters.
Well, that I know that comments were made by both RCAF and the other members of the military about their feelings after these things. There's entire movies based on that idea. I think that, again, with reference to Victory in Europe Day, which passed not that long ago, without much fanfare or notice in many quarters due to the ongoing pandemic, which took far less lives than that war did. The thing that kind of occurs to me is, again, this sacrifice, the question of sacrifice, and on behalf of liberties and freedoms that you might not get to enjoy yourself because you're in a position of sacrifice and laying your life on the line. I don't think that spirit's been taken out of us entirely, but it's definitely been curtailed in recent years.
Well, it has, and I think there's certainly a COVID fatigue that's going on here too, right? I mean, I know last year I made an effort to try to commemorate some of these things through my local Legion, and this year I've just been the enthusiasm level is getting lower and lower about this kind of stuff. I mean, people want to be able to breathe free again, and that this is not happening, and that there are continual. I mean, we're hearing talk now that masks might be a permanent thing, or if vaccine passports and all of this kind of talk is out there, and it's really causing a lot of angst in society generally. And I'm looking at a government that is being extremely reactive and jumping short-term plan to short-term plan, and doesn't appear to have a long-term vision, although they may have long-term goals. And I don't know. I'm not impressed, and I think I share the views of a lot of people out there.
From short-term plan to short-term plan, this is something that's become very clear in British Columbia as well as throughout Canada, and indeed much of the Western world, save for a few small state authorities here, there, and everywhere that have started to realize that it's time to relax restrictions, or who never bothered imposing severe lockdowns anyways. The question becomes, if that's the trend in Canada, how do they have the evidence to back that up anymore? Every little short-term plan they've had, that's the reason it's been short-term. It hasn't worked. At what point do you just admit that what you've done hasn't worked and just kind of try and let people do it on their own?
Well, it's called escalation of commitment, Nathan. It's when you've bought into a particular agenda and you put so much of your resources or your money or whatever into that agenda, and you think, well, if we just do a little more, we're going to be okay. And I think the classic example of that is the Hydro-Quebec project. When all this resources, money was put into Hydro-Quebec, and we just spend a little more, it'll make money. It'll never make money. And it's just it's too expensive. And I think that we're in escalation of commitment in terms of COVID. They've committed so many resources to this. They've committed such a narrative to it that to dial it back is really very, very difficult without attacking the credibility of the premise on which everything was based.
It's funny that you make this argument. It's something that I've kind of noticed now, especially in the last couple of years. Anybody who's still bothering to talk to each other, both the left and the right, are talking. They're basically both using Marxian language to discuss these things because it's the only tool they have. So to talk of sunk capital or invested capital, lost capital, the kind of structures of things. I mean, it's funny that you make this point about Hydro-Quebec, because for a lot of people who are environmentalists, that's the exact same argument they're making about Site C. So the idea is that it's sunk so much capital into it that they have to keep going. But then we have to put more money in the machine to keep it going. But I mean,
it's too expensive to fail, right?
Yes,
and that's the problem with escalation of commitment.
mm-hmm.
Any investor, when you're investing and you're trying to make money, when you look at a thing that's a loser and you say, well, if I just put a little more money into it, it's a strategic disaster for you. So you have to say at one point, I've got to cut my losses and get out of this. And I think we're at this point here now.
Well, this is interesting because again, so there's that environmentalist argument, right, with Site C. There's an investment argument around Hydro-Quebec, but then in a political argument, especially for the people who are most devoted in this platform and the people who are most devoted in this news organization, they are clearly sovereignists, and they would make the exact same argument around Canada. There was this escalation of commitment. The Western provinces should have never joined, and even if they did join, they should have gotten out the moment that it looks bad. Now we're 150 years into this, and we should just do away with it while we can and move on.
Well, those arguments were made in 1867, 1868, and so on, and for a few years after. Nova Scotia, the Atlantic provinces were starting to realize maybe they bought into something that was going to be dominated by central Canada, and it has been, and it ever since, really. And that's not a surprise. It shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. I think the issue is that there has been an unwillingness to be flexible about shifting demographics in Canada to deal with the realities of the way the country is now.
And of course, the country's demographics are shifting. One of the things that might happen during COVID, actually, just as we've seen in the United States, there's been a big shift in demographics down there. So people are fleeing. It's funny. We have new slave and free states in the United States. We have harsh mandate states and free states. So the states that have had the harshest mandates, that have made the least amount of sense and still have record deaths, people from there who are able have fled. They've left the state. Florida is filling up. So South Dakota. So are a few other states throughout the middle and southern United States, because there the restrictions have always been less harsh, and people are just tired of it where they are. Do you think something similar might happen in Canada, where people kind of shift around and people are more in favor of restrictions are going to those places and people are less in favor of going to others?
Well, the thing in Canada is our healthcare system is under the responsibility of the provinces. Some of the funding for it comes from the federal government. And there is a big difference about how this is all happening across the country. And we're seeing, of course, very severe lockdown regimes in Ontario and Quebec. You've got this very harsh agenda there. You see differences in large urban centers based on rural. I mean, up where we are in Prince George, I mean, the sky is blue, the birds are flying around chirping, kids are going to school in classrooms with teachers. They've got mask issues, of course, going on. But there is some level of social interaction. But apparently that's not the case in some of these other larger centers. I mean, I took a trip down to Vancouver last June as part of some things I was doing for meetings and so on. And I was absolutely blown away with how empty the streets were. Like you could walk across Granville Street and you didn't have to look left or right because there wasn't any traffic. There were no people walking around. There was nothing. It was actually quite pleasant. But I mean, it's a different world.
It is a different world. As we all recall, I was on the road at this time last year, just before this time last year. I had arrived in Churchill by this point.
Yes.
But I did travel across this country in the midst of our lockdown and the pandemic and the initial panic that was felt by all people at that point. And
you got to see it firsthand when you were busy spending your CERB money.
That's right. For those who don't know, because I was laid off due to the pandemic, I was entitled to CERB. I only took one. I didn't take more. I took one. And with my CERB payment, at the recommendation of a certain president of a certain National Firearms Association, I went and bought myself a 4570 Marlin, a trapper, actually. So the nice 16.5-inch barrel. for my polar bear protection when I was up north. 200 rounds of ammo and a case, and I looked pretty cool walking around up there as a guide with a lever. It was pretty cool.
Well, yeah, and you'd be a little bit more credible than the shotguns.
Yeah, it looked like I was, like I am status First Nation, and I looked like an Indian guide. It was pretty good. It was a
Yeah,
pretty good time.
yep. Well, if you're going to be serious, might as well go big or go home. That's my
Yeah.
recommendation on all that stuff, Nathan. I'm glad that worked out well for you. It sounds like you learned a lot up there and benefited a great deal from it, and it's good to see.
No,
And,
absolutely.
it's too bad that poor old marlin ended up at the bottom of a river somewhere when your canoe sank.
No, it's really too bad. It floated down the Churchill and went on its way. The beluga picked it up. The beluga wanted to, not hunt it anymore. So to protect himself, he took my marlin from me. So
Of course.
it's I think what's funny with it all is that I was there at Ground Zero too, because on May 1st, speaking to our friends in Alberta, I was in Edmonton at Cabalas South on May 1st, 2020, and that of course was when the in the midst of the pandemic, of course, the gun ban came down.
Yeah, the order in council was brought in on that date. You were there to see the panic in the stores.
People were mad. They were mad, sir. They were very mad.
And they have every reason to be. This is not acceptable, and it cannot be defended. I mean, I've talked to lots of people across the country about this, as you can imagine, including police officers serving and former, and military serving and former, and many of them own these type of firearms, and they own them and they use them for their recreational opportunities and for fun, and they're not real keen on any of this. And there's a lot of division about this in the senior ranks of police, because many of them also are firearms owners, and they don't see the sense of this. It's not supportable on the empirical evidence that any of this has got anything to do with crime control. And while police are saying, well, extra resources would help us, taking away firearms from ordinary Canadians is not going to solve a crime problem in Toronto or Vancouver or anything anywhere else. It's just got no relationship to it. We saw this incident in Vancouver the other day. Was a shooting at the airport. That has nothing whatsoever to do with your Marlin or my Remington or anybody else's other firearms in any other private hands. It's got nothing to do with that. It's got everything to do with a criminal activity, and it has the taking away of our guns has everything to do with a civil disarmament agenda, which has been going on for some 60 years.
One of the things that kind of strikes me about all those instances, whenever there's a shooting in Canada, it really always does reflect back on law-abiding gun owners. Like, have they ever bothered doing something or making some kind of legislation that was ever going to counter a violent offender in any way?
Well, any counter a violent offender. The problem is it's hard to predicting specific individual behaviors is hard. You can see warning signs, indications, and all the rest of it, but actually making public policy around people that are doing outlier things is really crazy. Like you don't need to be making laws to deal with the rare event. You need to deal with general large-scale issues that you can work with.
Traffic stops, bridges, big picture.
In infrastructure, they can't fix potholes in the streets. Why are we sitting here trying to change societal mores? Let's deal with the little
they
things.
Fix the environment, Sheldon. Let me tell you, if we just pay a little bit more, we pay just a little bit more, that everything will be fixed.
Escalation of commitment. That's what it is.
So how do you de-escalate commitment? Like, maybe that is the honest conversation that has to be had. How do you get people to come down?
That's hard, you see, because it involves acknowledging that what you have doing to that point has been in error. And you have to accept responsibility for having made a mistake, acknowledging what that mistake is, and then changing it in a dramatic and radical fashion. I mean, it's like an addiction, right? You need the same change that makes that addiction stop or transfers it to something else at least. So it's hard. It's not easy to de-escalate a commitment, and I think that's the problem. If that's really the goal, if they actually want to change the direction we're going in, it's not easy to get away from the commitment that has been put in place.
It isn't easy to get away from it, and you can see it all the time in our leadership. Something maybe we could reflect on for a moment as well. We've talked a little bit, both in the opening statement as well as with Nadine earlier. There seems to be a problem with our elected officials just abdicating their responsibilities entirely. Our MPs don't go to work anymore; they Zoom call in. Our legislatures are run by Zoom. What has happened here? The bureaucrats are running the system. The elected officials, I guess, show up for a plenary session every couple of months, and that's it. Where is the leadership? Where is the direct control of democracy by those we elected to represent us and lead us?
Well, platforms like Zoom, which I'd never really heard of before all of this went on, have really become the norm, the new normal, to use that overworked term. I mean, I taught all my classes this last semester on Zoom. It was not an experience that was in the best interest of the students or me. It was an expedient to deal with a circumstance beyond our control. That's what it was. And I think we're seeing a lot of interesting, flexible things go on. I mean, we had to hold our AGM by Zoom last weekend. And the attractive part of that is you can bring people in from all over the country. And that's great. The destructive part is you can't have those in-person conversations that resolve problems, answer the big questions, and just generally build relationships. That just doesn't happen with a Zoom type meeting. And I know the frustrations are very much there in everyone who is engaged in this kind of a platform sharing, whether you're using StreamView or StreamYard or Zoom or other platforms in order to communicate. It's not ideal, and it needs to change. I mean, I've seen businesses who have engaged in things like concerts or large conferences who are looking at this and they're going, well, what are we going to do here? All of these businesses across the country have all of a sudden figured out that, hey, we can do this on the cheap without having to send people to conferences and pay for hotels and all of this and flights. We can just do it all by Zoom. And this is a really dangerous and short-sighted bit of thinking that does not build the necessary relationships that are essential for success. You don't have those interpersonal relationships, and it makes everything much more corporate and cold and dangerous.
And of course, somebody could be recording the call at any point. Whereas, in a personal conversation, I suppose that's also possible. But if you feel like you trust the person to say a word or two that maybe you didn't really want to say outside of a private setting, it's a little different. It's a little different. It's Big Brother's always watching. I think that
this is very much the talking head. I mean, my God, this it's Kafka, it's Orwell, it's the big voice coming at you from the screen telling you how to live. Oh my gosh, did we not read the books? Did we not read? It just stuns me to make reference to some of this and realize that I'm talking to people who have no idea of that history or of that literature.
And how quickly that tyranny came together as well. It's interesting too, because whatever dystopian model you're trying to use, even Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake, the point is that it is all the same in the end. It is very much the tail wagging the dog. We create a society that it is an escalation of commitment to the point where it is, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. We become slaves of the technocracy that we created, and we can't get out because it's the only thing that feeds us, clothes us, heats us. Which comes back to your point of firearms and independence, being able to take care of yourself. Subsistence hunting, or even just hunting recreationally, like at least getting outside and knowing a thing or two about a North Star, or how to get through a rainstorm, how to build a fire, and then how to take an animal from creation and then treat the animal properly and eat the animal and consume it and have that
with
energy.
respect.
with respect. These things, like these are things that are very important, and yet we're becoming more and more inured to them and more ignorant of how to do them.
Well, I think there is a real move in a lot of this to try to take away the strong, resilient individual ability to survive in one's environment. Those kinds of skills are becoming less and less common as societies become more urbanized. And I think that's one reason I really like hunting myself as an activity. I mean, I'm a hunter examiner. I teach for the provincial corps program. I believe very strongly that it's important for more people to get involved in those activities to really understand where they fit in the ecosystem and where they really are, and to go out and observe what's happening in their environment. You get much more contact and connection with your environment by going out and being in it than you do from learning about it by Googling it or watching what somebody is telling you in a podcast, right? That's the point. And I think people lose sight of that connection, and as they become more and more enamored of the technology, they forget about the reality of the world in which we live.
And that seems to be so much of what is going wrong with what's happening right now. Whether we're trying to teach children from a Zoom call or we're trying to work by Zoom calls, it's not to condemn Zoom. It's just that the disembodiment of things. We've entered kind of that paradise of the disembodied. You live in your home. Your groceries can be delivered to your door. You don't see anybody, and you just participate in the world virtually, which of course means a representation. Virtually does not mean like, it means likeness, not the same. So
the German word, I think, is ersatz, isn't it?
That's right. Ersatz. Yeah.
Ersatz.
We're in fantasy land. We're not in a real place anymore, and that disembodiment, I think, is starting to take a psychological, societal, and political toll.
Well, it's a pale imitation of reality, and I mean, Zoom, for all of my concerns about what it's doing to us in terms of our social interaction, it's a necessary thing. We would not be able to do any communication, and is no communication better than some? Well, I think it's important. I mean, I was, on a major conference a week or two ago, which was all done by Zoom internationally, and wow, it wouldn't happen, and the participation was up from what it would normally be. But the problem is, you don't go and have the small group breakouts and discussions and get to know people on a personal level. You don't have that. It's just this two-dimensional talking head on the screen, and it's just not good enough. We're a social animal. That's what people are. We crave human companionship. That when you don't have it, you just don't perform at the same level. And this is why you're going to see things like suicide rates go up. You're going to have depression, people wondering what it's all for. What kind of a world do we live in? Poor me. All of this. All of these things are a dangerous side effect of the way in which this entire situation is being dealt with.
And speaking of which, my father, of course, whom you grew up with, as a psychiatrist, he has really seen the uptick in suicide rates and admissions to an astronomical degree, something he's never seen before. Even in some of the worst economic downturns that he's been a doctor in and had to help people through. Obviously, economic downturns always cause mental health issues, particularly suicide attempts. And of course, drug use causes suicide attempts. There's all sorts of things. But in the last 15 months, this has gone through the roof. And he's really noticed it. So obviously what we're doing it appears to be more dangerous when you look at both the opiate deaths from overdose and then the suicide attempts. It appears to be more dangerous.
And I think people are becoming less accommodating as well. I mean, you're seeing more snapping about things, and the whole the spacing issues, all of this, following the rules. You have people who are resistant to rules versus people who haven't met a rule they didn't love, and you're seeing this great split, and it's actually interesting because it's in some cases it's crossing political lines. And
Yeah.
I find that to be really quite an interesting effect.
It is the great winnowing fork. I know I'm always full of biblical allusions, much to your chagrin, but it really is, though. It has been the great divider, and in an incredible way. I've referenced this before on the show, and I got to write about it at my old gig at the paper here in town. But that point of being up north in a small community, which was kind of the last place to have to deal with COVID, they had no infections while I was there. None 3 or 4 months later when I wrote that column, and so they'd never had it in the flesh. They'd never had COVID in the flesh, but the fear got to them to the point where we had the last summer without COVID. There was no masks at bars. We enjoyed ourselves. We just had a nice time. There was no need for masks. And then the mask mandates finally came down and people were accosting each other in the grocery store. If there's only one grocery store, so you're going to see your neighbor there. And just that people who lived together for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, people who knew their neighbors for their whole lives, political differences aside, race aside, like religion aside, COVID was the thing that finally broke them.
Well, look at the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, right? People who lived together as neighbors for decades all of a sudden turned on each other. It's shocking. I was just looking at one of the comments from Ian Thomas Bleakney about why we don't talk about self-defense. And we do, actually. We're one of the groups that actually does talk about self-defense as being the essential aspect of firearms ownership. I've been very vocal about pointing out that safe storage laws, for example, are basically anti-self-defense laws. That's why Kim Campbell brought them in, and she was very, very clear about it. There's a large undercurrent of Canadian society that owns firearms only for self-defense and for a general defense of society. I mean, your purchase of your Marlin wasn't because you wanted to go hunting. You got that for defense. For work, you were using it for polar bear protection. That was the essence of what you're doing, and there are many of us in Canada who actually do use firearms for defense when we're engaged in both work and recreational activities, or just because we want to have that kind of ability if we need to. So it's a very, very big thing, and it's an essential argument about firearms rights and firearms ownership.
And it is the primary reason that I own my firearm, certainly. That's why I got a gun. You're right.
Well, I would just say to Dan, I had an interview many years ago with a firearms officer, and we were talking about home invasions and break-ins, and he pointed out, he said, well, the penalty for breaking into someone's house is not death. So, why should you have the ability to defend yourself? And my response was really quite simple. I said, hey, the penalty for breaking into someone's home may not be death, but the penalty for being broken into may be death from that particular individual. You have no way of reading someone's mind or determining what their intent is. You just know they're not supposed to be there. And, you have rights. Castle Doctrine does apply in the British Commonwealth. It applies in Canada. You do have rights, and you do have the requirement to act in a responsible way and do only what's necessary to protect yourself and get rid of the threat. It doesn't mean you can go out and start blazing away or anything like that, but you can do what's reasonable and necessary in the circumstances you're faced with, and that's what a reasonable person would do in a reasonable situation. I'm not a lawyer, and when you want to look at self-defense law, you need to talk to people who are well versed in it. And I think Dave Young in Montreal. There's legal advisors around who know this area of law very, very well. But quite frankly, it's what's reasonable and necessary in the situation. Mm-hmm. So I hope that addresses Ian's point there. And the recreational use is part of the argument. It's part of it for sure, but it isn't sufficient. And self-defense is very much a necessary part of the argument for why we should continue to own any firearms we want to.
As we come to the end of our time here, Sheldon, maybe you can kind of give us some predictions about what's coming around the corner here. Is the election coming down the pipe this year? Is it actually going to happen? Are we going to get out of this anytime soon? Is Bonnie Henry ever going to let my people go? What's going to happen here?
Well, I appreciate the oracle status with which you try to put on me, Nathan. But like I said, my crystal ball is pretty foggy. I've been of the view that the election, if we're going to have one this year, is going to be in the fall rather than in the summer. It may well be in the summer still. Some people are still talking like there'll be a call in June, and then that could well happen. There's still time. But if it was going to happen, I would have thought it would have happened over the budget, and it didn't. So my sense is when you start to see easing up of lockdowns in Ontario and Quebec and so on, then you're going to see much more interest in having an election. I mean, this is a government here which is an ineptocracy. They've clearly failed at almost everything they've tried to do. They are guiding the country along in a path that I don't like very much, and I think there's lots of other people out there who don't like the path we're going on. But they have popular support from a broad swath of people who tend to be enamored of their leader and of the relative safety and security which they are sensing or getting. And I think they're misplaced and they're wrong, but that's politics. So what's going to happen? I don't know. We'll see. But I know that I'm going to try very hard to make sure that what's there now isn't there after it.
Not fair enough. I believe the old phrase was trust in God and keep your powder dry. It's keep your powder dry. Absolutely. And never ever give up your guns. Never compromise on your freedoms, and just stay true to your principles. Have principles and stick to them. Don't feel you can just toss people under the bus and move along. I mean, it's all about principle. It's about ideology. It's about rights and freedoms and doing the best thing. Yep, the best that we can. Well, we've been speaking to Sheldon Clare, president of the National Firearms Association. We're so thankful to have him on today. Good friend of the show, good friend of mine. We'll bring him back on in the not so distant future, but thank you for being here, Sheldon.
My pleasure, Nathan. It's always good to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, that is the show we have for today. I guess if I have any closing thoughts, it's interesting how many times things just kind of kept looping around to that fundamental question of representation, freedom, and having our democracy back, having our government back, having everything back. And so I think that maybe one of the things we can kind of dwell on here as a final conclusion is, how are we going to take that back? What kind of message are we going to send? How are we going to start not complying in the little ways that begin to build up to the big ways that eventually just sends the message loud and clear that this isn't happening anymore. We're not going to take it anymore. We're not going to take it. We're not going to take it. No, we're not going to take it anymore. Funnily enough, of course, that was Twisted Sister back in, I believe that was the 80s. It was the early 90s. We all remember those congressional hearings and the fact that ACLU had to get involved, right? And, try and explain why censorship was bad and everything else. Here we are 30 years later, and people on the left are the ones doing the censorship, and it's the people on the right that are trying to do something different. I think that's where we kind of have to ground our hope in a brighter future, is that people are getting tired of it. People don't want to take this anymore. They want a change. They want things to improve. And if enough of us do that at once, if enough of us simply will not comply, will not obey, will begin living life as it was before the pandemic, taking whatever cautions we have to, but being honest with ourselves that we know that this isn't working, we know this is a fraud, and we all need to just move on and chill out. I think that there's a way forward there. I really do. So this has been Mountain Standard Time. I'm very thankful for your attendance during this period. We'll throw up the email just quickly as just a final reminder that, we always want people to be brought on. We want your suggestions. We want your comments, your questions, your concerns, and your encouragements too. It's sometimes it can be a bit lonely in front of this camera and stuff like that. And you just gotta keep rolling and try and figuring out what the next step is. Who am I going to call as my next guest? What topic should be addressed next? What should the opening statement be about? I need suggestions. I need suggestions. This is a team effort. I can't do this all on my own. I'm very thankful for my producer as well. He does an incredible amount of work here. We'd be nowhere without him. No questions at all. and of course the guests we've had over the month and a bit now that we've been doing this. But finally, I just want to say thank you to all of you. Thank you for tuning in. And again, shoot an email my way. Let me know who you want brought on, and just let us know how we're doing and how we can improve things. That's what we want to hear. We want to do what the viewers need us to do, and we want to be transparent with you about what we're doing on our end. That was Mountain Standard Time this Tuesday. I believe it's May the 11th. Get your census done because it's due today, or don't. And maybe that's your first act of non-compliance. Figure that out. But that was Mountain Standard Time. I'm Nathan Giede. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you again tomorrow.